In this tutorial, I'm going to show you where to put CSS and JavaScript in your HTML file. So here I have my basic HTML file. I'll start with inline CSS. All you have to do is type the style attribute directly into your HTML tag that you want to change. Then the equals and double quotes. So within these double quotes, you're going to type the CSS commands. So for example, background blue, and refresh the page. And as you can see, we just used inline CSS to paint this line into whatever CSS we enter here. It could have been font weight bold, for example. And as you see, that changed that to bold text. So this can be applied to any tag that you want. So color, let's say red, and we changed that as well here. So use the style attribute. This is called inline CSS. Before we move on, I want to show you what user agent CSS is. So for example, let's say we add the B tag to this element right here. Refresh the page, you will see that we added the bold text. But let's go into inspect option and see what the console says. You will see here that the browser adds its own CSS to an HTML tag automatically, and when that happens, it's called user agent style sheet. So let's go back to our previous inline CSS example. What kind of CSS tricks you can do here will depend largely on your knowledge of CSS. The more CSS you learn, the more commands, properties, and values combinations you will know. These are just the basics, but you might want to learn flex, grid, and some other things. CSS transforms, animations, and transitions, stuff like that. So it's very powerful what you can do with just the, style. We're going to take a look at why you shouldn't use inline CSS in just a moment. But first, let's go to the next one, which is the internal CSS. The internal CSS usually defined in the head tag within the style tag, but you might also want to add type text CSS explicitly. It's still going to work without that, but it's best that it's there so that we can be in compliance with correct HTML. Now, the CSS code is twofold. First, you have the CSS selector, and then you have the brackets which describe which styles you want to apply to those selected elements. To select multiple elements, you simply separate them by comma, like this. If I wanted to select the paragraphs, the list tags, div and section, for example, you just separate them by comma, and the style will be applied to all elements of this type. In CSS also we have the star selector, which selects all of the tags on your page. So if I set background to yellow, it's going to apply background yellow to every single tag in your HTML. I'm not going to go in detail on how you can use all these different CSS selectors and properties and everything. I'm going to have to create a separate tutorial for that, because in this tutorial we're only talking about where to enter CSS in JavaScript, which is coming up next. You can also use the external CSS, which means that you can specify all these CSS styles in a separate file, right? So let me go ahead and create a new file. And let's say background black. Now I'm going to save this as style.css. Let me just make sure that it's a CSS file. So I'm going to save that. Now I'll go back to my original HTML file. Type the link tag. Make sure that it's somewhere in the head. The link tag only works inside a head tag. Link. Use the rel attribute. And make sure it's set to style sheet. Use the href and specify the style that we just saved. So, and using this tag will actually import this style CSS file into our HTML. So as soon as I do that, it will actually apply all of these styles. And let's see, I'm going to refresh the page, and you will see that if I change this to blue or yellow, it's actually importing this CSS from a separate file or an external file. And that's how this link works. So usually it's a good practice to separate your CSS into a separate file from the rest of your HTML. Now I'll go back to where I have my CSS defined, and let's just delete all of that and start from scratch. So I have something like this. Now let's say that my body tag has ID A and class B. So that can be represented by something like this, A, and for the class we use the dot B. So let's say we set the background to black in this ID, so which will refer to this body element by selecting it by this ID. So the ID attribute turns into the hashtag. I'm going to refresh the page. As you can see, everything was applied as you would expect. So now we have class. It's also attached to the body tag. So we have class attribute with the B. If we set background to white, again, through that class, and I'm going to refresh the page. And I keep refreshing it, but nothing's happening. So what's going on here? Well, this is called specificity. And yes, usually CSS styles are applied from top to bottom. So for example, we expected this to be changed to black, and then we expected this to overwrite that to white, but that's not what happened. That's because CSS also follows specificity rules. If you use ID, it doesn't matter what else goes below it. It takes precedence over all the other types of styles. Now imagine you've been working on your project for days or weeks, and you forgot that you had somewhere some style applied through the ID, and you'll use the class CSS selector to change it, and when you change it, nothing is happening. So what a lot of people will try to do is, that's right, important. So when you do that, it will take precedence back to this class. But this is not a good practice. If you ask pretty much any web developer, they will tell you to never use important. Why? Because, well, as you can see, the reason you really used important here is because you did not understand that the ID took precedence, and that's like a key fundamental rule to CSS. So what you're really doing is you're hacking the layout, you're not doing it properly. Yes, it still works, and it's a quick solution. That other ID tag that at some point in the past applied this property somewhere in your CSS file. So you go and apply important to it. And it's like it's a hack. It's not really following CSS rules. So it's usually advised against doing something like this. So what should you do in this case? Well, one solution is simply not to use the ID to style your elements. So use B, which is a class. Then you might ask, well, why do we even have IDs? Well, IDs can be used to exactly what they sound like, to identify a very unique element. For example, the application container. Let's say this section here has an ID of root, but this is a special container. It's the parent of all of these other tags. Let's say in my application or web page. So it's a very special element. And this is when we should use root. And remember, you can also select HTML elements by ID from your JavaScript. And IDs are kind of like links to those more important elements that are identified by unique name. So when you use JavaScript, it makes a lot more sense to select something by an ID because it's a unique element. So if you want to embed something else into your root element, like a different page or different content, you can select it in JavaScript and write something into this content. But as you can see, that's a completely different use case in JavaScript than CSS for styling. And basically use IDs for extremely unique elements, but use classes to style elements. Just to show you how, let's say, for example, you type another B selector background white, this time it's actually going to work because this is not an ID. If it's a class, the precedence is the same. So regular CSS rules apply here. So first we style this one and then this one. You don't have to do important or anything like that. But again, if you do add it here, this will not even going to work. So again, as you can see, the precedence, it's either the important or the ID. And you need to understand all these little rules if you want to write proper CSS style for your web page. And so now I'm going to show you the fight between the important. Let's go back to the definition of the ID, right? And I'm going to add important, and now it takes precedence. Not only it's an ID, it's important, and this combination is stronger than the style. But if you add important to the style, it takes more precedence again. And as you can see, this can be very confusing unless you understand proper order in which these properties work and apply to the rendered results on the screen. So it's usually decided to keep all of your CSS in one external file instead of just doing these crazy important things and change styles in IDs, classes, and the style attribute. So because of all of these reasons, ideally, you don't even want to use the style attribute. I know I started my tutorial by saying that's how you do it, but again, you shouldn't have to use it at all to create any style that you want. Just use primarily classes and IDs in special cases when you need to indicate some special element for selecting with JavaScript. Just the best thing you can do is take all of your CSS code and move it out into an external file and have this as, you know, the source of truth. So if anybody ever changes anything, it should be found in just this one file, and you should avoid importance at all costs. Just don't use them. Instead, just try to create proper CSS by understanding how precedence rules work, and you'll never have to deal with weird situations where something doesn't work because it's defined somewhere else. So in this next part of this tutorial, I'm going to open the developer tools so we can see some JavaScript output. And I'm going to show you how to insert JavaScript into your HTML page. And there are basically 4 different ways. The first one is the inline events. The only thing is that you actually have to memorize all these event names because there's no such thing. You know how with CSS we use style, but with JavaScript there's no such thing as script tag. But you have all these different events, like let's say onload is an attribute, a special attribute for outputting JavaScript. So in these brackets, you'll type JavaScript. I'm going to use the basic console function. We're in onload. So something like this. I'm going to refresh the page, and you will see that the onload basically means whenever this HTML tag is loaded into the page, immediately we're going to execute some of this JavaScript code. Now, one other thing you can do is use the onclick. See, like you have to memorize them, and that's really pretty much the only way to do inline JavaScript. But a lot of the time, you really only need a handful of these attributes to get your way around this inline JavaScript code. So the onclick now, I'm going to say here body clicked. So refresh the page, and every time I click on the body, you will see that this text will be printed into the console. Of course, you can have any JavaScript here. This is just an example. Another thing you might want to use is the onmousemove event. Moving on body, right? So refresh that, and whenever I move my mouse, you'll see that there's an event being generated every time. They also have onmouseenter. Entered body. So refresh the page, and this will fire whenever the mouse moves into the element for the first time. They also have onmouseout left body. So this will execute every time the mouse is moving outside of that event. So here's a few times. The reason you see it executing so many times, even though I'm not really leaving the body, it seems, that's because I'm actually entering those other elements here, and that's counted as leaving the body. So it almost seems like I'm generating the onmouseMove event, but it's really the mouse is entering and leaving the body into those other elements. So there's a lot of events happening when you move the mouse. So this is called inline JavaScript. We just added this JavaScript into an attribute, and this works on most other tags as well. So let me delete that. The next way of adding JavaScript to your HTML is by embedding it using the script tag. So script, and let's enter something into the console. Hello there. And if you refresh the page, you will see that we just outputted this, because as the page continues to load, eventually JavaScript will be executed from any of the script tags that are being downloaded in real time. So then we're going to execute this one. I'm going to explain this later. But basically anywhere, let's say hello from body. So we just embedded some script tag into the body, and again, as the page keeps loading, it will reach the script and execute it immediately. So refresh. So hello from there, hello from head tag. Then we have hello from body. And it's basically going to work anywhere. Hello from the bottom. So as you can see, anywhere you use the script tags, it's going to execute it as the page continues to load. It doesn't even have to load the entire DOM. So at this point, when this is executed, this body tag is not even available yet for JavaScript to process. So if you try to execute some code that deals with body tag in here, chances are it's not going to work. But it still might if the page has loaded fast enough. So, but I would try to avoid doing something like that. And that's why we have the DOMContentLoaded event. And again, I'm going to show it to you a little later after we go through the inserting or adding JavaScript into your HTML page part. So if you want to be proper, you might want to say language JavaScript, and it just makes it more proper. You're telling the browser that you're using JavaScript in these script tags because yes, it's possible to use some of the other languages as well. The most common way of doing that is what you want to do is to use the type attribute with text/JavaScript. So you might as well want to add this to all the other tags that you're using here. And still, it's still going to work without them, but it's much more proper to do it this way. So I would include that in my code. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and show you how to add some external JavaScript by using the script tag as well. So it's a little different than the embeddable script tags. But basically what you want to do is script src, and you want to use some existing file name. So here I already created console log. We're in script.js. So this is a file, script.js, that I already created and put in the same folder where I have this insert.html file, which is this file. So if I can specify the file name of that program that I created and simply including it with the source attribute is actually going to execute everything in that file. So let's go ahead and try that. As you can see, it says here, we're in script.js, and that's caused by us including that file using the src attribute. Also, keep in mind that there's no such thing as the link rel JavaScript. This is only for stylesheet. So it's not going to work with script JavaScript file. So there's no such thing as that. If you want to include some other file externally, just use the script tag instead. Now, let's go ahead and delete all of this, and I'll demonstrate something else. Say we have refresh the page to clear that up. So basically what you want to do if you're developing an application or a web page, you want to wait until all of the HTMLs have finished loading, and that's called the DOM tree. And we have a special event here on the window object. You can start listening for it by using add event listener function, and basically what you want to do is capture this DOMContentLoaded event, and here I'm using an arrow function. Let's output something, console log hello from DOMContentLoaded, right? So let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you will see that we're executing hello from DOMContentLoaded message from this event. And this is important because it is executed when the browser has downloaded all of these elements. Again, as the browser downloads your page, it does it as soon as it has something streamed into the browser. So as it reaches this code, we're attaching the event to DOM content, so it's not going to be executed right away like the previous scripts. It's actually going to wait until the browser downloads all of these tags. This is important because if you try to access in JavaScript some of these elements before they finish downloading into your browser, you're going to generate some errors. So this means whenever you want to manipulate those elements in any way, always use the DOMContentLoaded. So this is like a rule. Every time you develop an application or a web page, you should always use this event to start messing with your elements in the structure of your page using JavaScript. So for example, here, what we can do is get the root element, document.querySelector, and select the root, right? So we're selecting this element. And what then you can do is root style background color black. So we just use JavaScript to dynamically change one of these elements, but we also waited until all of the elements finish downloading. So this means that we're guaranteed that this root element will be actually part of the document object model at the time when we call these JavaScript functions to select it. And if I refresh the page now, you can see we've successfully changed the background color of this root element. And so this is why basically you shouldn't just create script tag like this and do your JavaScript here. It's always best to just wait for this event to happen. That guarantees that your program will not run into some error by not being able to find some of the elements that are still being downloaded. This is called the entry point of your JavaScript program, and it's so important that in Chrome browser, where you have network here, let's refresh the page. You will see that there's a special line to indicate when this event occurs. It's very close to another event. So they use a red line for the DOMLoaded and the blue line for the window.onload event, which is another one. I'm not going to go into window.onload in this tutorial, but that's another entry point. This one is extremely important. This is where your program starts, and JavaScript is guaranteed to give you access to entire DOM. The blue one is for waiting until the media loads, like images, videos that are separate from the DOM tree. They're so important that Chrome actually has these two lines to show you when that actually happens. I'm not really doing anything in this file, so that's why they're so close. But if you open some other websites, let's say Google, right? You will see that there's a much more distance between the onload DOM and the window.onload event. So different websites will show different results, and in different network conditions, you will see different results as well. But basically, make sure you understand that if you're planning on developing apps. So let me go back, and basically I'm going to delete all of this and go back to my console. So up until this point, we used the type attribute to specify text JavaScript. But there's one more way of importing a module into your program. And basically, you're required to change this type from text JavaScript to module. So, and this turns your JavaScript block into something that can import modular JavaScript code from another file. You can actually import just one function from the entire file, or one class, or one object, or you can import all of them. But basically, this type module is what allows you to use the import keyword. And it works like this. Let's say you want to import a function called fun from, and you have to use a dot and slash to end up in the same folder where your HTML file is, and then use the file name of that script file you want to import it from. Now, because you're importing a fun function from script, it's required that this function should exist in that script, so you can start using it here, right? So let's go into the script file, and I think the way you do it is export, and then you type your function. So console log hello from fun function. And so it's a regular definition, except add export keyword here. So go back here, we import fun, and let's see if we can execute that. Let's see if it's going to run. So it says access to script is not allowed or something like that. And that's normal because we're not running from a fully set up web server. It's a direct link to the file. But if this file was located on the web server like localhost, it would definitely work. In fact, I just did that here in my browser, and as you can see, it outputted the message from our script file. So that's basically how you import functions from an outside external JavaScript file. Now, I'm not going to go into setting up your localhost environment in this tutorial. Again, this is not a tutorial about that, and I probably should create another tutorial on doing that, running your server directly from your local host environment. But again, in this short tutorial, I just wanted to explain how to include all of these different JavaScript scripts into your HTML file. And basically, these are the 4 ways of doing that.